You're listening to the Bedtime Sleepy Historian. It's late now, perhaps the window is open a little, and a cool breath of air drifts through the room. The day is fading, and the world outside is soft and blue. So let's settle in. You can rest your head. And tonight we'll wander, gently, back into the Middle Ages. To a time when survival was not a guarantee. And when famine came, it crept quietly across the land, like a shadow that stretched from village to village. But even in those hungry years, peasants endured. They found ways, humble, clever, and sometimes desperate, to stay alive. Tonight, we'll walk beside them. We'll see how they saved, scavenged, prayed, and persisted. A slow story. About hunger, hope, and the quiet strength of ordinary people. So close your eyes. And imagine the distant toll of a church bell, somewhere across the fields, calling the village to evening prayer, while the hearth glows softly in the gloom. The lean year. When the crops failed, it rarely happened all at once. First, the peasants noticed that the stalks were too short. The heads of grain felt lighter in their hands. Then came the rain, or the drought, or sometimes both. And in a village of thatched cottages and narrow paths, you could feel the tension begin to settle, as if even the birds grew quieter. A medieval peasant did not live far from the edge of hunger. Most years were just enough. Enough barley to bake the coarse, brown bread that filled the table. Enough beans, onions, and salted pork to stretch the winter months. But when the harvest failed, when mildew blackened the wheat or frost came early, they entered what was called the hungry season. In the earliest days of scarcity, the first instinct was careful rationing. Families would measure out the grain with wooden bowls, each portion slightly smaller than before. Children were sent to bed early, so their bellies would ache less. And the evening talk around the fire grew quieter, as each person wondered how long the stores would last. In those lean months time slowed. Each sound in the cottage, the creak of the door, the stir of the pot, the distant bark of a dog, seemed sharper somehow, as if hunger tuned the world to a thinner note. And outside, the sky stretched pale and wide over the empty fields. And in the background, the hearth kept crackling softly. Bread of desperation. Bread was life in the Middle Ages. It was more than food, it was a kind of rhythm. Every dawn, flour dust rose in cottages across the village, as women kneaded dough with the same slow gestures their mothers had known before them. But in famine years, flour was scarce, and what bread could be made was often mixed with strange companions. Peasants would grind acorns, chestnuts, or even ground up ferns to stretch a handful of wheat. Barley, oats, rye, all were blended in rough, bitter loaves. Some even added bark from young trees, stripped, dried, and crushed into powder. This famine bread, as later historians called it, was gray and heavy, often hard to digest. Yet when hunger gnawed, it was still better than nothing. Villagers shared it sparingly, cutting slices so thin they seemed almost transparent in the firelight. The taste lingered in the mouth, a faint bitterness, a reminder of the forest's presence in their bread. And yet to eat it was to survive another day. A small act of defiance against the failing of the earth itself. In the quiet after supper, they placed the last crumb back in the coarse linen bag, wrapped it tight, and listened to the wind brushing over the thatch above. Foraging the forgotten woods. When the fields yielded nothing, the forests became a lifeline. Every peasant child learned early how to tell which berries were safe, which roots could be dug without sickness. They gathered nettles, sorrel, dandelion, and wild garlic. They pulled mushrooms from damp logs, their fingers smelling of moss and soil. Even the bark of birch and linden could be stripped. and boiled into something faintly nourishing. Women knew the paths by heart. The ones that led to hazelnut groves or hidden berry patches. Sometimes they went out before dawn, before the Lord's forester could accuse them of trespass. For the woods were not theirs, not truly. Most forests were under the control of the manor, and taking from them was a quiet rebellion, a whispered risk carried in every basket. Still they went, because hunger is older than law, and in the hush beneath the trees, they worked quickly, quietly, as sunlight filtered through the leaves, like 1,000 tiny coins of gold. By evening they returned home with their hands stained green, and in the background, the forest kept murmuring softly. The quiet trade of survival. When one family's storehouse was bare, they might visit a neighbor under the pretense of borrowing a tool. An old iron knife for a little barley. A bundle of wool for a pot of peas. Trade was often silent, built on years of trust. In famine years, barter replaced coin. No one wanted silver they couldn't eat. And so, the lanes between cottages carried whispers of exchange. A loaf of bread wrapped in cloth left on a doorstep. A jug of thin ale traded for a few eggs. These gestures wove the village together. A network of quiet generosity and quiet debt. There were also the traveling peddlers, thin men with hollow faces, who came with carts of strange goods. Salt, oil, dried fish, and sometimes stories from other starving villages. Their visits were both hope and sorrow. For if they had made it this far, it meant the famine stretched far indeed. But still, the peasants listened, leaning in as if to share warmth from the tale itself. And when the peddler left, wheels creaking into the dark, they watched until he vanished into the mist. And in the background, a lonely owl called once, then fell silent. Faith and fasting. In times of famine, the peasants' hunger was not only of the body, but also of the soul. They had grown up in a world woven through with faith, where each sound, each season, each trembling of the wind, was thought to hold meaning. When food disappeared, prayer filled the space it left behind. At dawn, the church bells still rang, thin, echoing over the fields, calling the villagers to kneel on cold stone floors. They prayed to Saint Isidore, the patron of farmers, and to Saint Anthony for the lost, for sometimes what was lost was not just livestock, but hope itself. The priest would remind them that hunger was a trial, a test sent by God to purify the spirit. And in a world where explanations were few, many took comfort in the thought that their suffering was not without purpose. If the harvest failed, perhaps it was a punishment for forgotten prayers, or for gossips spoken too freely. And so, confessions grew longer. Candles burned late into the night. And in every cottage, the sound of quiet weeping mixed with whispered psalms. But faith was not only solemn. It was also practical. The villagers held processions through the parched fields, carrying relics and crosses high, chanting for rain to fall. In some places, they fasted not by choice, but in the belief that their abstinence would soften heaven's heart. Women hung wreaths of wild herbs on the doors, and sprinkled holy water over the bare soil. Men carved small crosses into the bark of the apple trees, hoping that next year the fruit would return. There was a strange peace to it all, a rhythm that made the suffering seem almost shared, as though the whole village was breathing in time to the same quiet prayer. At night, when the air was cool, and the stars hung heavy over the empty fields, a candle still glowed in the chapel window, and if you stood near enough, you might hear the low hum of voices, singing the same plea over and over, that tomorrow would bring rain, and that God in His mercy would remember them. The candles flickered against the stone, casting long, slow shadows across the floor. And in the background, the night crickets kept their steady rhythm, like a heartbeat beneath the dark. The hidden cellars. Every peasant cottage had its secrets. Not secrets of scandal or sin, but small, practical mysteries. Ways of keeping hunger at bay when the world grew cold. Beneath the packed earth floors, there were cellars, dark, damp, and lined with stone. Some were barely large enough for a crouching man. Others wombed like burrows beneath the house, their air thick with the scent of earth and roots. In these quiet chambers, food was life preserved. When harvest was good, they filled the space with sacks of grain, jars of pickled cabbage, and salted meat hung from the rafters. A few sprigs of dried herbs were tied in bunches above. Thyme, sage, rosemary. Not just for seasoning, but to keep away insects and bad air. When famine came, the cellar was no longer a storage room. It was a treasury. Each jar became precious, each crumb a decision. The mother of the house would descend slowly, lamp in hand, to count the jars that remained. She might hold one up to the light, studying the cloudy liquid, turning it just so, as if hoping to see a miracle inside. Salt was the great preserver, and every pinch had value. Peasants knew how to cure fish caught from the rivers, how to smoke meat over smoldering oak, how to dry thin slices of apple on the hearthstone. These were arts passed from mother to daughter, quietly, patiently, over years of watching. They knew how to keep the mice away, how to dig a little deeper where the frost could not reach. Some even built small vents through which cool air could move. A primitive kind of breathing system for the earth itself. But when the famine dragged on, the cellars grew emptier. The jars stood like ghosts in their rows, their contents long gone. And still, families would descend the steps at night, holding their lanterns low, as though the memory of abundance might fill the belly a little while longer. There were stories told of cellars hidden beneath cellars, of secret pits dug under the barn floor, where the last grain was kept. The priest said hoarding was a sin, but so was letting one's children starve. And in that gray moral space, many peasants did what they must. They guarded what remained in silence, pretending they had nothing left, while beneath their feet, the earth kept its quiet hoard. Sometimes, in the deepest winter, a child might creep down to the cellar steps, just to breathe the scent of what once was. The faint salt, the dry sweetness of onions, the lingering memory of smoke. It was a smell that meant survival, and the faint promise that spring would return. Above, in the sleeping house, the wind pressed against the shutters. The embers in the hearth glowed a deep orange, and somewhere in the distance, a fox barked once sharply, before the night folded back into silence. Children of the hunger years. Children remember famine differently, not in seasons or grain weights, but in moments. The feel of a smaller meal, the way their mother's hands grew thinner, the quiet that settled over the cottage. When there was nothing left to stir in the pot, they still played, of course. It is the nature of children to find games even among sorrow. But their games changed. They made dolls of straw instead of cloth, and counted stones as though they were apples. When they ran barefoot through the village, their laughter carried lightly, as if afraid to disturb the air. Many were sent to glean, wandering the edges of harvested fields, searching for stray heads of grain left behind. It was patient work. A child could spend an entire day, stooped among the stubble, finding enough wheat for a single loaf. But each kernel was a small triumph. Each handful a reason to keep going. Older children learned to snare rabbits or fetch water. To watch for birds' nests high in the hedgerows. Eggs were treasures. So fragile and bright that breaking one felt like a sin. In hard times, even the smallest acts, a found egg, a hidden root, became the center of the family's day. At night they listened. Adults whispered of distant famines, of villages where people had vanished into the woods, never to return. The children didn't understand all the words, but they understood tone, the slow worry in their fathers' voices, the way their mothers held them longer before sleep. And still, there were moments of warmth, a shared crust, a story told by the fire about better years, when the rivers overflowed with fish, and the fields glowed gold at harvest. Stories were a kind of food too, nourishment for a hunger that bread could not reach. Sometimes, when snow drifted against the door, and there was little to eat, a child might dream of feasts, tables heavy with bread, bowls of milk and honey, roasted geese that never grew cold. They would wake to the crackle of frost. But for a moment, the dream lingered, warm and kind. In the mornings, the village stirred again. Thin smoke rose from chimneys, and the children went out into the pale light to fetch sticks for the hearth, their breath ghosting before them. And in the background, the faint clatter of their wooden shoes echoed softly against the frozen ground. The Lord's fields and the church's granary, famine in a feudal world, was never entirely private. Every peasant's hunger was tied to the wealth of those above them. The Lord's field stood at the edge of every village, wide, enclosed, and better tended. When the harvests failed, the villagers looked toward them with both hope and resentment. They knew that inside the manor stone storehouse were sacks of grain, barrels of salted fish, and ale brewed thick for winter, and they knew that access to it was not guaranteed. Some lords were kind, opening their barns and ordering bread baked for the poor. Others turned the key in the lock and waited for the famine to pass, unmoved by cries at the gate. It was said that even a cruel lord was still a part of the world's order, and rebellion against him was rebellion against God. But hunger can erode fear, grain by grain. There were stories of peasants who crept into the Lord's granary at night, taking a handful, just enough to survive. If caught, the punishment was severe. A hand cut off, or worse. Yet desperation made them bold. The chroniclers rarely recorded their names, but their footprints are still there, somewhere in the dark soil beneath the manor walls. The church, too, held food. Every monastery had its granary, its fields and vineyards. The monks were bound by charity to feed the hungry, and in many places they did. Lines of villagers would form at the abbey gate, bowing as they received a ladle of thin broth, or a small loaf marked with the cross. The smell of cooking grain was like a benediction, rising through the cold morning air. But charity could not stretch far enough. For every bowl given, 2 more waited empty, and the monks, though pious, had their own mouths to feed, their own fear that the famine might last beyond what the stores could bear. So, the peasants prayed for generosity, and watched for signs of compassion. Some found it, others did not. And through it all, the social order trembled, but did not break. A village might starve, and still, the bells would ring for Mass. Still, the Lord's banner would hang above the hall. The world, in its strange way, kept pretending to be whole. Yet sometimes, after the evening curfew, a peasant woman would slip away, to leave a few kernels of barley at the foot of the church door, not as offering, but as reminder, a silent plea for mercy from those who kept the keys to plenty. Inside the granary, the air was thick with the smell of dust and grain. Rats scurried between the sacks, their tiny feet whispering across the floorboards. And in the background, beneath the sound of the wind against the walls, a faint rustling could be heard, the sound of abundance, waiting in the dark, while the village hungered outside. The return of spring. It did not happen all at once. The end of famine was quiet. First came the softening of the ground, when frost melted into dark, rich mud. Then the first shoots, green and tentative, pushing through the soil like whispered promises. After months of gray, the world began to color itself again. The peasants watched the sky, still half afraid it might turn on them once more. But the rains that fell now were gentler, patient, soaking the fields instead of drowning them. The air smelled faintly of life returning. Wet hay, turned earth, and thawed roots. Children were the first to smile. They ran out barefoot, pressing their toes into the mud, their laughter echoing between cottages that had known too much silence. Women walked the fields, their hands grazing the young barley shoots, as if blessing them. For the first time in months, the ovens burned again, not with bark and husks, but with flour ground from new grain. It was rough, yes, and the bread small, but its scent filled the cottages like an answered prayer. Men sat quietly at the table, breaking it slowly, reverently, as if afraid it might vanish if eaten too quickly. In the evenings, neighbors gathered again by the wells, speaking in low, cautious voices. The famine had passed, but it had left its mark. Some families were smaller now. Some fields had gone untended too long. Yet there was a kind of peace in that survival. The quiet strength of those who had seen the worst, and were still standing. In the churchyard, new grass grew over the graves of that hard year. The bells rang again for weddings, for christenings, for the return of life in all its fragile forms. And across the landscape, the rhythm of the world resumed, the steady creak of the plow, the call of the blackbird in the hedge, the smell of bread in the air. The famine became memory, but in every seed sown that spring, there was a whisper of gratitude. And in the background, the earth itself seemed to hum softly, as though sighing in relief. The memory of hunger. Years later, when the famine was only spoken of in winter tales, the memory still lingered. Old men would tell the young how thin the moon had looked that year, and how the rivers froze too early. Women would shake their heads and murmur, "We boiled bark for bread." In each generation, the story changed slightly, but the feeling did not. The famine became a quiet teacher, a warning not to take plenty for granted. And so each autumn after harvest, peasants stored their grain with ritual care. Every sack tied, every cellar sealed. They measured not only what they had, but what they might one day need again. They also gave thanks. At the village feast, after the first loaf of the season was blessed, there would always be a moment of silence, not for speech, but for remembering. For those who did not live to see the green return. For those who had shared their last crust. Without hesitation, children, hearing these stories, half believed famine was a kind of ghost, something that could be kept away. If one spoke kindly of the land, if one never wasted food, if one remembered to thank the soil itself. And in a sense, they were right. For hunger was not only physical, It was spiritual. It haunted not just the belly, but the way people looked at the world. It made them humble before the turning of the seasons, and grateful for the simplest of meals. When night fell on these villages, centuries later, the same patterns endured. Bread on the table, a prayer murmured before eating, a candle lit for those who had come before. All of it descended from those long, hungry years. The quiet endurance, the faith that carried them through. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it. The soft echo of hands grinding grain, the whisper of wheat in the wind, the pulse of a world that once starved and learned to live again. Outside, the wind sighs gently through the fields, and in the background, the hearth keeps crackling. A small, steady sound, as ancient as survival itself. And now, as you rest, let the famine fade into the distance. A story of hunger, but also of endurance. The peasants of medieval Europe did not have much, but they had persistence. They foraged, prayed, bartered, and waited for the earth to turn again. And when it did, they greeted spring with quiet gratitude. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, you might think of them. The mothers who baked bark into bread, the children who gleaned single grains from the field, the fathers who kept the fire burning just one more night. History remembers kings and wars, but survival, that belongs to the common folk, to the ones who simply endured. So rest now. Let the story settle like dust on an old wooden beam. Outside, the fields are peaceful again. The famine is over. The hearth glows faintly in the dark. And somewhere far away, a church bell rings once, and fades into sleep.